But as Donald Trump is like catering to that fringe, as I said, he's undercutting his support. And I've said this, he's hurting himself with key groups that are going to be critical to him getting reelected. You know, that question was actually raised by the Washington Post, Greg Sargent, and he put it in his latest column, and the numbers back him up. Overall, a new Morning Consult poll finds that a majority of Americans 65 and older now disapprove of the president's handling of the outbreak. That poll notes that support has dropped 20% since last month. 20% since last month. It's evident in specific policies. Listen to this, because it's the seniors, as we've been saying here, who are going to die if there are reckless policies pushed in Georgia or in Washington, D.C. or anywhere. 75% of workers said that non-essential workers should not be allowed to move freely outside for social activities or work. Just 16% disagreed. Josh Kraushaar of the National Journal pointed out that seniors are, quote, counting on the president to protect them at a particularly precarious moment. If Trump's desire to quickly reopen the economy ends up backfiring, they'll be the first to abandon him and deal his reelection prospects a crippling blow. By the way, that's already happening. And that's what we've been warning the president, that it was happening. And we've been warning him, hoping that he would do the right thing and follow medical advice instead of listening to 8% of crackpots who want Fauci fired. And anyway, so Joe Biden right now leads Donald Trump 52 to 43% among senior citizens, according to the latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. Again, that's another huge swing, a 16-point swing from Hillary Clinton lost seniors by 7 points to Donald Trump in the 2016 election. As Greg Sargent writes for the Washington Post, Trump's effort to turn the coronavirus into a full-blown culture war that divides the country to his benefit appears to suffer from a very serious deficiency that has eluded his notice thus far. Willie, though, this guy, this guy, I mean, he's not dumb. When it comes to politics, he's got great gut instincts. Now, doesn't he have to know that if Larry Kudlow's saying, we've got this contained, go back to work, everything's fine. If Stephen Moore is saying, people die, if people on news stations that he's watching seem to put forward the argument, you know what, it's nothing more than the flu, or you know what, let people get back to work, a 2 to 3% mortality rate, it happens. They have to know that it's supporters of Donald Trump, and it's Donald Trump himself when he's talking about, quote, liberating people from medicine and science and protecting senior citizens and protecting the greatest generation. They've got to know it's their lives that are being put on the line by reckless policies. This is not a rhetorical question. Like, doesn't he understand that?
Well, he understands polls, he understands ratings, he understands a list of numbers that shows how he's doing. That's the one thing he can respond to, and he does respond to, and he does talk about all the time. He, of course, won seniors in 2016. They were one of the groups that propelled him to victory over Hillary Clinton. He cannot afford to lose them if he wants to be reelected in 2020. But for all the reasons you just laid out, they are turning on him. It turns out, when members of the Republican Party are saying, well, it's the lesser of two evils, we might have to lose a whole bunch of seniors to get our country back to work, seniors aren't going to respond well to that. When Donald Trump is rushing people back to work, and seniors understand how grave and serious this problem is and how vulnerable they are to it, they don't like the sound of people running around the country and contracting the disease and passing the disease on. So he does. He knows about poll numbers. And when he sees a 20-point swing among seniors, a 20-point swing just in the last month, that's something he's going to respond to. Let's bring in White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Yamiche Alcindor. Yamiche, we were just discussing the president and seniors. We're discussing his relationship to polls and how much he watches them. What do you think he makes of these new numbers that show seniors, as they watch this play?
Of the fact that he has to have some senior voters, especially senior voters in the critical swing states that put him over the edge because his win over Hillary Clinton was just so narrow. So I remember thinking about the fact that the president was at one point going after mail-in voting, going really hard, saying without any evidence that there was all sorts of mail fraud if people mailed in their ballots. And then he paused and said, well, at the same time, I want to make sure that we understand that seniors and military members, they should still be able to mail in their ballots through absentee ballots. So it shows you even then, when he was railing against mail-in ballots, that he was very understanding of the fact that seniors were a part of his critical, at least a critical group that he needed to go after. If we could maybe push it out a little bit larger, I will say, in watching the president over the last couple of days, what we've seen is that these White House briefings have increasingly turned into campaign-style events, and the president is very understanding of the fact that this is the only way that he's able to communicate with the American people. So we've started to see him do really interesting things. The first thing that I would point out is that he's starting to say that talking about testing is somehow a personal attack against him. I posed that question to him a couple days ago, and the president said, no, it's not a personal attack on me, but people are talking about this because they want to take me down politically, and they're thinking about the November election as they talk about testing, which of course is a critical thing that Americans everywhere, Republicans and Democrats, they all want testing to be expanded. It's critical to reopening the government, but the president is so aware of the fact that that's part of his re-election campaign and part of something that might hurt him, that he's really now trying to push off testing completely to a state issue and not really taking any sort of responsibility for the testing issues that are still ongoing.
Well, and Jonathan Lemire, you look at, Yamiche brought up the mail-in ballots. That's yet another example of Donald Trump, who has always been able to read an audience. Donald Trump is he's on the wrong side of the American people on just about every issue here. You talk about mail-in ballots. NBC News, Wall Street Journal poll out this week show a majority of, I think like 55, 56, 57% of Americans support mail-in ballots, expansive mail-in ballots. You talk about these movements to reopen the governments, reopen the states, reopen businesses before these medical guidelines are met that the White House themselves put out. The overwhelming majority of Americans, are against this. Donald Trump and some of his sycophants in the media are suggesting that it's just like medical doctors and people in the media who were spouting this. This is the same BS that they were saying back in February, that the coronavirus was being hyped up and the hyping was a hoax by the media. As we've been saying every day, Americans, you can lie about Robert Mueller. People are like, okay, whatever, I got to get my kids ready for school. I got to go to work, and I got to pay my lease this month. But when you're lying about their health, and they've got a doctor to call, and they've got friends that have recently gone to nursing homes who have people who are dying, and they're afraid that they're going to be dying, and it's spreading all over the place. And they're reading stories and seeing stories of teeming bodies being found in New Jersey nursing homes, in Brooklyn nursing homes, and they understand that could be them. You can't lie your way out of that. So you follow Donald Trump for a very long time. He always seems to be able to read his audience. How is he missing this? And I'm just talking politically. We've criticized him nonstop about not listening to his doctors enough. But how is he missing this politically? How could he screw up so badly with senior citizens, like one of his most important groups, that there's a 20-point swing against him, and that Joe Biden is now beating him by almost double digits among seniors? How could he be hurting himself among blue-collar voters? Where's his blind spot coming from, Jonathan?
The president, as you say, Joe, usually does know how to read a room. He usually does know how to read a poll, but he is missing some stuff here, and people around him are growing concerned, because you're right. It's one thing to say, to dismiss an investigation as partisan or a product of the deep state or as fake news, but it's very different when you have to sell Americans, and not just your base, which obviously he spends a lot of time focusing on, but that thin sliver of Americans who disaffected Democrats or independents or those who held their their nose and gave him a chance last time, and he'll need again this time around. It's hard to convince them that to downplay this when, as you say, they know someone at a nursing home who is sick, or they've lost a job, or even just their favorite restaurant went out of business. And this is a very different matter. And we wrote over the weekend, taking an early look at some of these battleground states that are going to decide this election and how the coronavirus, the pandemic, and how that is impacting them. And one of the things we looked at, indeed, was the president's starting to lose support of seniors. And we know how important those are in a few states in particular. Trump campaign advisors that we've talked to privately are deeply concerned about Michigan, which they thought was, of those 3 states in the Midwest that he flipped last time around, was always going to be the hardest to hold at this point because he's had a fight with the governor there. I know we're seeing some protests in Lansing, but there's deep concern with the unemployment there, the surge of coronavirus cases around Detroit, that Michigan may already be slipping away. Wisconsin's another. 2 other states. Florida, of course, we're seeing outbreaks there. It has the questions about how the governor has handled things. That's why the president is sort of out of nowhere tweet about the Villages, the large retirement community there in Florida, offering words of support. That was done, I'm told, with an eye of trying to buck up some of the senior citizens reporting. And one more state, Joe, as a final thing, Arizona, which also, of course, has a large number of senior citizens. We looked over the weekend, and we reported on it. That state also, according to Trump advisors, is getting very, very close. Joe Biden and the Democrats feel good about their chances to play there. And if they can flip Arizona, the Democrats, that decreases their need to flip the states in the upper Midwest.
All right. And Joe, I mean, it's the one-trick pony thing. It worked in New York City, this branding, this constant changing, this jumping around.
Right.
It worked on Mueller. It worked on Ukraine. It's not going to work on a pandemic that is killing people.
Well, we've been saying it, Willie, nonstop. And speaking of Mueller, we, of course, have the news from the Republican Senate Intel Committee
That's
that
right.
we're going to be bringing you that undercuts all of his arguments about the FBI. He called them scum earlier this week. Yeah, his own Republican Party disagreed. But Willie, this is, again, you look and the stupidity, the political stupidity, the political malpractice. First of all, and I'm just saying of so many of Donald Trump's people who think they're helping Donald Trump. I mean, you look at the president himself, these press conferences, as we've been saying for weeks, it's not helping him in the polls. Seniors are looking at this, and it's scaring them. If you look and see what the Wall Street Journal is writing, what the National Review is writing, what conservative outlets are even writing about the president's preposterous claims and his reckless claims, if they're writing that, then you know seniors who are swing voters are scared to death. You look at what the Republican leadership in Wisconsin is doing, and again, I gotta believe they're a wholly owned subsidiary of Biden 2020 because of the stupidity and the recklessness in which they've engaged in over the past several weeks, and they're still at it. Like this Liberate thing, like it's really a small fraction of Americans. And it's damaging Donald Trump standing there. And you talk about Michigan. My God, he insulted Michigan's governor time and time again. She has a 75% approval rating. You look at Pennsylvania, obviously concerns about outbreaks of east and west there. It's basically Joe Biden's home state outside of Delaware. I mean, this is a president who has lost his political ear at the worst possible time for him politically, but for the rest of America as far as health care issues go.
Yeah, and it goes beyond that 20-point swing among seniors, Joe, which he won by 7 points. He won 65 and older voters by 7 points in 2016. But I'm so glad you raised the protests because we see those images on the news. We see the people walking around with AR-15s. We see the woman leading out of the truck yelling at a nurse, telling the nurse to go to China if he likes communism. But the truth of the matter is these are small protests, and I'm going to submit that we're not actually that divided, and that includes Republicans. It includes conservatives. 60% in the NBC poll say they're worried about opening the economy too soon, and that includes sections of the voters that elected Donald Trump. 49% of rural voters in that NBC poll, 49 to 39, said they worry about opening the economy too soon. 51%, a majority of non-college whites, which President Trump dominated, say they worry about opening the economy too soon. These numbers are all in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll. So we're not actually that divided. Americans are doing a great job staying at home, trying to thwart this disease, trying to flatten the curve. And the images that the president is trying to prop up and show and get out there of some of these protests actually represent a small percentage of where we are.
We really, Mika, Willie's right. America is so much closer on these issues than some people in the media would want you to believe. You look at the numbers, not just the NBC poll, you can look at the Pew poll, you can look at just about every other poll. You can talk to small business owners who desperately want to get back to work, but understand if they get back to work too soon, they will lose their companies forever. A lot of family-owned businesses who are just getting absolutely pounded right now, they want to get back to work, but as you know, our friends say, only when it's safe. And the idea that this is some sort of political wedge issue, you look at the poll numbers, it's really not. It's a small fraction of people trying to get attention. I don't think the media should overhype those rallies. I think sometimes they do. But most Americans are united. We have to be responsible. Let's listen to doctors. Let's listen to nurses. Let's listen to healthcare workers, and let's follow that.
They're watching
guidance.
the bottom line. I was driving to pick up my mom, and when it's not just small businesses that are individual family-owned businesses, it's chains. There was a Chipotle. And I saw a huge sign, you may not come in without, they will turn people away. At least the one that I was driving by. They will not let people come in and buy their food if they're not wearing masks. And even then they're delivering, they have to protect themselves. Someone gets sick, they're shut down. So they've got no choice, no matter what the president says.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.